best podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidel minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
So, how do laws get passed?
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.
This is Heidelcast News. By popular demand, the Heidelcast is now on YouTube, which is the most popular podcast platform on the globe. Personally, I think we're replaying the Betamax versus VHS mistake, but what do I know? I'm just a disembodied voice. Find us on YouTube at Heidelcast. If you love the Heidelcast wherever you hear it, be sure to make a tax-deductible donation by making the coffer clink or by sending a check to the Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027. You know, it would be kind of funny if every time the postman slipped an envelope into the Heidel box, it made the coffer clink. I wonder if we could make that happen. Call or text now, 760-618-1563.
The fourth of our 5 points of Christian citizenship is legislate, and yesterday we considered briefly what it means to legislate, that is, to draft and pass a law. But how does it happen? How does one become a legislator, and how does policy become law? To answer this question fully would obviously take a whole series of podcasts, maybe a whole degree program, at an undergraduate institution. But the outlines of the process are fairly straightforward. First, let's think about how to become directly involved in the process of legislating, that is, considering and passing laws. And then we'll consider how an idea becomes a law. First, becoming a lawmaker. There are a few ways to be directly involved in the lawmaking process. The most direct and obvious way to be involved is to run for office and to serve a term or two in a legislative body. For example, city council, county board, or a state legislative body, or maybe even a federal body. Run for Congress, run for Senate. This usually means getting involved in party politics. In my home state of Nebraska, there's just one legislative body, the unicameral, and it's nominally nonpartisan. In most states, however, there is a bicameral legislature, two-house legislature, and so a House and a Senate. So let's imagine what it would take to run and win an election for the state house, for example. Well, one would first have to decide how one wants to relate to the political parties. As I'm talking with you, the lines between the two major parties have blurred on issues like abortion, but there remain significant differences in other respects. One then has to read the platforms and other relevant documents of the parties and talk to representatives of the parties and make a decision as to which of them most closely aligns with your convictions. The next steps are more difficult. Ordinarily, one has to get involved with the party at the committee level, develop relationships, trust, and an understanding of how the process works. And this is a good way to see how politics works on the ground and to see how campaigns are funded and run. It might even be useful to work on someone else's campaign as a volunteer or even as a paid staff member. So let's imagine that after a few years, one's ready to raise funds and run for the state house. A candidate has to have a position on issues of interest to the district in which one is running. To run a successful campaign, one has to persuade two constituencies, donors and voters. Without donors, it's virtually impossible to communicate one's goals and one's platform to the voters. And this takes time, it takes energy, and it takes dedication. It involves a great number of meetings with potential constituents. It involves time on social media and advertising, and sometimes even going door to door, at least in the old process. Now, making law. Let's imagine that one has learned the business of politics, has raised funds, campaigned successfully, earned the trust of the voters, and has been elected to office. Now, One must learn how the process actually works. Perhaps the most important thing to know about the legislative process is that it is essentially committee work. A state legislature is really just a large committee composed of representatives from different parts of the state with different interests, beliefs, and agendas. And much of the work of the legislature is done in smaller committees.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
Getting a law through the process means persuading people to agree that your proposed law is necessary, wise, constitutional, and feasible. And this happens over time and in steps. Laws are drafted in the offices of legislators, but they're also brought to legislators by interested parties, for example, lobbyists for private interests or just interested groups and citizens. Members of an organization may even go from office to office, meeting with legislators to persuade them to support a piece of legislation. So consider this proposed law. Where I live, about half of the homeless population in America also lives. And this is for a few reasons which need not detain us here, but it's a considerable problem. Recently, however, a decision by the Ninth Circuit Court was overturned by the United States Supreme Court, making it possible for cities, counties, and states to do something about the homeless, most of whom are addicted to narcotics and or mentally ill. The proposed law would require the state to build a sufficient number of inpatient facilities to detox the homeless population and to enable them to get clean and sober. The law would require the state to levy a statewide sales tax on cannabis and liquor purchases to fund these facilities. Once built, the law would require all homeless people either to enter treatment and remain clean or to enter a halfway house or find other private housing, or if this is unacceptable, to leave the state. Homeless camps would be banned and cleaned up forthwith. And to add a footnote to this, all you have to do is look at the news coverage of the recent fires in Los Angeles and in San Diego County to see the danger of homeless camps. Significant percentage of the fires in Southern California over the last month or two, and really over the last several years, have been due to homeless camps. People get cold at night, they set fire, and if it's dry enough and windy enough, those fires can get out of hand, and before you know it, you have a raging inferno. As a legislator, one would lobby other legislators and other influential members of the state, for example, mayors, members of city councils and county boards, as well as policymakers within the state government to gain support for the proposed law.
This is the Heidelcast.
Once the language of the draft has been reviewed by lawyers for potential conflicts with state or federal law, the next step is to secure support on the floor of the legislature to get the proposed law sent to a committee for consideration. This is crunch time for any potential law. If a law dies in committee, it usually remains dead until the next legislative session. Thus, any proposed law must be carefully crafted. Reports have to be written, and a case for the law has to be made. You remember those term papers you wrote in school? Well, this is why you were made to write term papers. This is basically what one does in order to make an argument for a law. It means holding hearings and bringing in experts to testify to the committee about the need for the law and to respond to criticisms of the law. So your office has to produce a strong enough case to persuade a majority of the committee to vote the law out of committee and onto the floor of the legislature for consideration by the entire body. Once the law is before the body, now you have to persuade a majority of the House, most of whom were not in the committee meeting and who haven't heard the testimony from the experts, and they probably haven't even read the arguments that you've made available to them. So your term paper that you wrote to, defend the law, they haven't read it. At most, they've read an executive summary. So it's possible that most of the members of the House haven't even read your proposed legislation. So on the floor, you have to advocate for the law. You have to instruct the body, teach them, well, what is this law and why is it needed? No, you have to know your business and you have to know your case. And to be frank, there's a high likelihood that your bill is going to fail the first time that you propose it. It might be sent back to committee, which is not a bad thing, or it might die on the floor until the next session. It would probably take years to get such a bill made law, the bill that I'm proposing, because it would be a revolution in social services, and the floor would be metaphorically red with the blood of all the oxen gored by the new law. After all, at least out here, the homeless industrial complex is big business.
Heidelcast.
Then there's an ugly part of legislating: compromise and deal making. This is the part of the process that most people hate, but I'm sorry, it's necessary. It's just the way it works. What if a member of the legislature asks for a revision of the law in trade for her support? What if a legislator offers to vote for your bill if you'll support his bill? This is the sort of horse trading that is part and parcel of the American political process. No bill gets from a legislator's desk to the law books without revision and without horse trading. A representative government is not a dictatorship. The executive branch is supposed to execute the laws, and governors, mayors, and city managers often have wide discretion, but they are supposed to be servants of the law and not lawmakers. The legislative branch may be the most withered of the three branches of government, but its function is vital for the health of the Commonwealth. And America needs wise, godly, skilled, and patient legislators more than it needs couch-burning, theocratic revolutionaries. In this part of the series, I've only been able to give just the barest sketch of some of the features of what it means to legislate, and I've only been able to describe briefly how the process works. But I hope it gives you, dear listener, a sense of how the process works. If you are not yourself called to legislate, then, as I say, you can always pray for those who do. Despite the rhetoric on both sides of the aisle, there are still decent people serving in state houses and other legislative bodies, even Congress, trying to do the best they can for their communities and their states. Certainly, the process is corrupted by private interests, bribery, and self-dealing. And we've been seeing quite a lot of that as I'm talking with you now. We've been learning about all the corruption involved with the USAID agency. But despite all that, the process goes on. The state houses are full of the people we put there, either by voting or by failing to vote, or to vote well and wisely. One way or another, we get the government that we deserve. If the Lord is stirring your heart to serve your community in this way, I hope this part of the series has been encouraging. Legislating is not brain surgery. It does take care for detail, an ability to understand those with whom one disagrees, an ability to communicate, an ability to build relationships and trust, and a willingness to work hard on behalf of people that you will probably never meet. Next time, what happens when everything goes south?
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.